right, I'm very pleased to welcome Bob Silbernagel today. Bob Silbernagel writes a regional history column for the Daily Sentinel newspaper in Grand Junction, Colorado. In addition to the Cadotte book, he is the author of 4 books about the history of the West. He was editorial page editor for the Daily Sentinel for 19 years. He and his wife Judy live near Palisade, Colorado. Please join me in welcoming Bob Silbernagel and enjoy the presentation.
Welcome everybody. Glad you all turned out here today. As Jenny said, I'm going to talk about the Cadottes, the fur trade, and my interest in Lake Superior. So a number of people have asked me why I chose to write about this region when I live in Colorado. Well, my wife Judy and I both grew up in the Madison area. We traveled to Lake Superior as youngsters, and over the last 30 years or so, we've gone many times ourselves. We've especially gone to Bayfield and Madeline Island, but we've also visited other parts of Lake Superior from Thunder Bay to Sault Ste. Marie. And as we traveled, I bought books, as I always do, about the history of the region. I found that the name Cadotte appeared often in journals and documents from the fur trade era. So I grew intrigued and then obsessed with finding out as much as possible about the Cadottes and the fur trade. And then I wrote a book. This was published by the Wisconsin Historical Society Press in 2020, promo that it won an award in 2021. Took me about 10 years to research and write the book. Part of that time I was still employed full-time at the newspaper in Colorado, but I retired in 2014 and devoted a lot more time to the book after that. Did lots of live visits to the region, as well as research in books and journals and manuscripts. So the Cadotte family has a long history of working in the fur trade in the Great Lakes, beginning with this gentleman, Madeline Cadotte, he would have pronounced it, and I've seen it spelled C-A-D-O-T or C-A-D-E-A-U. But he was born in France in 1649, arrived in New France or Canada sometime in the 1660s, and by 1670, he was on the Great Lakes on Lake Superior, involved with the fur trade. This is probably hard for you to read, but it's a family tree. Here's Mathurin's parents, Mathurin and his wife, and then in his first generation afterwards, several of his sons were involved briefly in the fur trade. They'd come in for a season or two and then go back to the Montreal, Upper St. Lawrence River, or Lower St. Lawrence River, and get into other occupation. It wasn't really until his grandson, Jean-Baptiste Cadotte Sr., there was anyone involved in the fur trade full-time throughout his career. And you notice I said Cadotte there. When he started, he was probably Cadotte, but when the British took over Canada, they changed it to Cadotte. They just said, well, it's got a T on here. It must be pronounced Cadotte. And then his children, I'm going to focus primarily on these guys, Jean-Baptiste Cadotte Jr. and Michel Cadotte, and Michel's wife, Equasayway. Well, Michel and Equasayway, who was a full-blooded Ojibwe, started in the fur trade in the early 1780s along the Chippewa River in northwestern Wisconsin. But by 1800, they had opened a permanent trading post on Madeline Island, which was named for Equasayway. Her European name was Magdalene or Madeline, and that's where Madeline Island got its name. This is from the mid-1800s, early 1800s, and the village of La Pointe, with a Catholic church, a few homes, wharf here with a sailing ship, and the town of Bayfield, which wasn't yet built, would be over here. The Cadotte family compound trading post home and farm was way over here on the east side of the island, looking out on the open waters of Lake Superior. And that compound was called an idyllic site by one of the early American Superintendent of Indian Affairs. And this plaque is still there. It was put up in 1926, and it sits on a big rock where the compound was. But the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Thomas McKinney, visited the island in 1828 when he was on his way to what's now Duluth. It was called Fond du Lac at the time, to arrange a treaty with the Ojibwe and several other Native American groups. He traveled by wagon or coach from Washington, D.C., all the way to Detroit, probably some river barges as well. And then from Detroit, he was canoeing up the west side of Lake Huron through Sault Ste. Marie, and from Sault Ste. Marie all the way over to Madeline Island. And he said when they arrived in Madeline Island, "This is the only place that brought gladness to my heart since we left Sault Ste. Marie." He said it was the first civilized place, civilized in European American terms. So civilized that he was amazed when he asked Michel Cadotte if he could get a glass of milk. Michel had it for him, because they had milk cows on their farm, they had vegetables, a few horses, goats. So they had a trading post as well as a log home and a small farm up there. Kind of hard to understand now just how important Madeline Island was at that time on Lake Superior. This gives you a look at not just Lake Superior, but all the way to Montreal, when this line of travel was roughly 1,000 miles from Montreal down the Ottawa River into the northern sections of Lake Huron, through Sault Ste. Marie, and then around the south side here to Madeline Island, or if you were with the Northwest Company and you wanted to go to Grand Portage, you may go the north way around. But there wasn't any place where you could stop and get supplies and stay somewhere besides camping, really, until you could in Sault Ste. Marie. But from there, it's roughly 400 miles. Madeline Island was the next place you could stop and do that. The river itself was filled with portages. I've read somewhere around 65, several of them pretty dangerous and long portages. People were killed in them, none of the Cadottes that we know of, but other people. So it was pretty important. So was Mackinac Island, which is right in here between Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. And it was important because there were schools there. It was the closest permanent Catholic church, and there were government record offices there. Well, we know from family ledgers of the Cadottes and other documents that they traveled regularly to Mackinac Island and all the way to Montreal. Both Michel and Jean-Baptiste Cadotte Jr. went to school in Montreal, were originally supposed to train for the priesthood, but neither of them wanted to, so they joined fur trade instead. Sister of Michel and Jean-Baptiste stayed in Montreal and helped manage the family's business there, because when they had trapped beaver and brought it back, then they had to ship it by canoe all the way back to Montreal, package it up to be shipped to wherever it was going for being made into hats and other garments. Unfortunately, there's no photos that I've found of Michel or Madeline Equasayway, or even their first generation of kids. But we do have some of their grandchildren. And this is William Warren, who grew up at the Cadotte compound on Madeline Island in the early 1800s. And as an adult, he became a legislator for the Minnesota Territorial Legislature. He also wrote the first book-length history of the Ojibwe people and their customs. And when he did so, he got much of the information from his grandmother, Equasayway, who was still alive while he was doing the research. Michel had passed away by that time, but he would have known Michel Cadotte when he was a youngster. This photo is from the cover of a book about William Warren by Teresa Schenck, a former professor here at the University of Wisconsin. And it's an excellent biography of an interesting man. This is his sister, Julia Warren Spears. She also grew up on Madeline Island and later became a teacher, the first one in northwest Minnesota, on several of the Indian reservations there. Late in life, she served as an Ojibwe interpreter for author and anthropologist Francis Densmore, who was writing about Ojibwe culture. The point I want to make is these, even though they grew up on Madeline Island, which was a pretty isolated spot at the time, they got a decent education, first in Madeline Island, then they went to some schools on Mackinac Island, and eventually William and some of the others, I'm not sure if Julia did or not, went to school in New York, where their father and uncle was from. They were not only educated, but they were engaged with their people being French Canadian, married into Ojibways. They were engaged with the Ojibways, relatives, and with white people as well. And they had to kind of walk a tightrope between the Native American, the French Canadian, and the American societies in which they dealt with. They both also witnessed firsthand the Sandy Lake tragedy of 1830, where about 230 Ojibwe died when they were forced to Minnesota and then came back afterwards on a grueling hike in the middle of the winter. Well, in my research, I viewed many books and documents, but also tried to get a little bit of firsthand experience about some of the places they lived and worked, snowshoeing on a trail that was used by traders and Native Americans for hundreds of years before the first Europeans arrived, kayaking in some of the places where they would have canoed. Not that I'm a great adventurer, I'm just trying to get a little bit of feeling for the places they lived and worked and the experiences they might have had. And I wanted to try to better understand the fur trade existence and what the Cadottes went through. To that end, I also talked to others who were engaged in activities they would have been engaged in, such as making maple sugar, trapping animals, gathering rice, and I also talked with a number of Cadotte descendants living in the Bayfield, Madeline Island area. And I wanted to find out more about not just the trappers, but the reason they trapped, the hats. So I conducted some research on felt hats. Hi there, and a tip of the hat to everyone for taking the time to watch this video. As you may have guessed, I'm going to talk about hats today, specifically beaver felt hats and the fur trade. So, as I said, my book came out in May of 2020, right in the middle of COVID. So we couldn't do a lot of the in-person events we'd planned with the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. So I made a number of videos that we posted on YouTube and Facebook and other sites. So that's why you get to see them today. Well, hats made of beaver felt created fortunes for fur traders, merchants, and others. And we know they've been around for a while. The first written reference we know of beaver felt hats that still exist today comes from the late 1300s in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. He talks about a pilgrim in the Canterbury Tales who's a bit of a dandy. He wears a Flemish beaver hat. So, this is a drawing from a fairly early edition of the Canterbury Tales. I don't know if that's the Flemish beaver hat he was talking about or not. Very well could be. But Canterbury Tales was written before Europeans colonized North America. So the beaver for that hat, or whichever hat he was talking about, would have come from Russia or Scandinavia. By the time Europeans started colonizing North America, the Russian and Scandinavian beavers were pretty much trapped out, and they weren't quite extinct, but they were close. The North American beaver became critical to the development of the industry here. I tried to get some sort of handle on how many beaver might have been killed over the centuries wasn't really easy to do, and I'm sort of guessing, but we do know that from various records, the number of buffalo or bison killed was between 30 and 60 million in the west of North America during the 19th century. Well, based on records I've found from a number of different Hudson's Bay Company posts that listed all the number of animals that were trapped and their pelts taken, I think they probably somewhere like 10 times that, maybe 300 million beaver, but over 200 plus years, not just in 1 century. Well, why were the beaver taken for their pelts more than any other animal? Turns out that the fur that protects the beaver in cold water makes it great for hats. There are tiny barbs in the underfur of the beaver that interlock, and somebody's described it sort of like the way jackets go together. They just stick together well, and it makes them hats that are nearly waterproof, flexible, and durable. So I don't know what the hat in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales looked like, but I know that there were many different styles of hats over the centuries. Okay, everything from military, here's a Continental hat from the Army during this Revolutionary War, a Navy hat, another later Army hat, a clerical or minister's hat, and then several types of stylish top hats. And these are all for men, but women also got to have felt hats as well, as long as you put in an extravagant ribbon or something. More hats were sold to men than anyone else, but women did get beaver felt hats as well. Well, the fur trade was not just around Lake Superior or the Great Lakes. Much of North America, from the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock Colony to the Dutch in New York to the settlers in Virginia, were involved in trapping or shooting, killing animals, and getting their furs for sale. But it was the primary economic driver for New France or Canada for centuries. The demand for felt hats also drove the search for beaver from the East Coast to the West Coast, including the Rocky Mountains. And this is a drawing showing one of the notorious Rocky Mountain rendezvous that were held on the Green River or near the Green River in Wyoming and Utah during the 1820s and 1830s. At those rendezvous, there would be hundreds, maybe even thousands of Native Americans, lots of trappers, French Canadians, as well as Americans. This guy almost looks like a military guy. There would be Hispanics coming up from New Mexico, Arizona area, and there would be representatives of a variety of companies, including the Hudson's Bay Company, the Northwest Fur Company, the American Fur Company, which was John Jacob Astor's company, and representatives of small firms, as well as independent trappers and traders. But it's interesting to me because, I mean, this is pretty well known. There are a lot of books and movies about the trappers and traders of the Rocky Mountains. But the Rocky Mountain fur trade really was fairly short-lived. 1820s to 1830s, the last big rendezvous was 1840. So around 20 years. The fur trade around Lake Superior lasted 200 years. So it was critical. Well, the business was more than just trappers, like this guy, Jim Bridger, or his buddy, Kit Carson. There were also people like Sir Alexander Mackenzie, who was knighted after he made the first recorded crossing of North America from the east side to Pacific Ocean, going both by foot and canoe. He reached the Pacific Ocean in 1793, 12 years before Lewis and Clark made their famous trip to the Pacific. He was also the first European known to have reached the Arctic Ocean by an inland route. He went up by a big, wide river, and today we call that river the Mackenzie River. But he wasn't just an explorer. He was deeply involved in the fur trade business. he employed at different times both Jean-Baptiste Cadotte and Michel Cadotte through the Northwest Company. And in his journal, he explained why it was what he called a very heavy business. For instance, in 1798, the Northwest Company lost 40,000 pounds of furs on a ship that was going to China and sank. They also had to pay heavy tariffs and fees to take their furs into different countries. The British East India Company, which had the greatest fleet of freight ships, gouged them heavily, and later they built their own ships, both to travel in the ocean, but also on the Great Lakes. Additionally, there was an entire lending industry developed in Europe and North America just to serve the fur trade. So guys like Jim Bridger, Alexander Mackenzie were both very important, the traders, the people with connections to Europe, but the backbone of the fur trade industry were the Voyageurs, who paddled the canoes, and these are the large, some of the larger Montreal canoes that would have come from Montreal to Lake Superior, and then there would be smaller canoes that went out into the backcountry from Grand Portage or from Madeline Island to take traders and goods. They'd come out with their goods and then go back with furs and take them to Montreal to be put on ships and sent all over the world. Well, when the Voyageurs weren't paddling canoes like this, they were carrying their heavy packs full of furs or trade goods, usually 90-pound packs, and most Voyageurs carried 2 packs at a time, so 180 pounds. And that was over long portages like the Grand Portage at the west end of Lake Superior that today goes into the Boundary Waters canoe area in Minnesota. 8.5 miles. I've been on that trail, but I haven't been on all of it. It's a difficult trail. And to carry 180 pounds just seems crazy. Some accounts say Voyageurs carried 3 packs and even 4. So that would be 300 plus pounds. And this is how they carried them, with a band across the head. You had to have a pretty stiff neck, I would think, to do that. And tough legs. And you may not be able to see it, but this was drawn by a young artist named Frederick Remington, who drew stuff about the Voyageurs before he went out west and became famous doing paintings of cowboys and Indians and cavalrymen. The Voyageurs trapped and traded. They also drank and ate heartily. They often lived with or married native women, and they lived a tough life, but most of them loved it. This is from a Voyageur near the end of the 19th century who'd spent 41 years in the fur trade. He said, "I could carry, paddle, walk, and sing with any man I ever saw. No portage was ever too long for me. I have saved the lives of 10 Voyageurs. I've had 12 wives and 6 running dogs." It's not clear whether the dogs are more important than the wives. I spent all my money in pleasure. Were I young again, I should spend my life the same way over. There is no life so happy as a Voyageur's life. They did enjoy it as tough as it was. Well, once the furs were trapped, they had to be processed. And this is from a trading post in Alberta in the early 1900s. But I like this picture because it shows different pelts up here, maybe wolves or fox. This would be the beaver, the rounded one here. And then these packs. And in the back country where the traders and trappers spent the winter, they would build a screw press, and then they'd put a certain number of furs in it and squish it way down with the screw press, and then they could put rawhide over it and strap it down with rawhide or rope, and those are the bundles that could carry, the Voyageurs who carried them. Well, trapping obviously required traps. And before Europeans arrived, Native Americans used a variety of traps or devices to catch animals: nets under the ice, snares and deadfalls, spears and bows and arrows. but metal traps arrived in North America soon after the first Europeans. And they became the primary means of capturing beaver and many other animals. They were popular because they could be easily transported, they could be hidden beneath snow or soil, they could be staked underwater to drown an animal. And contemporary writings from the fur trade era show that metal traps were almost always a part of the trade goods that were taken out to trade with Native Americans or to supply the Voyageur trappers who worked for the traders. Lake-hold traps aren't so popular now. My state of Colorado outlawed them in 1996, except in special situations by licensed trappers. But many states, including Utah and I believe Wisconsin, still allow them for commercial trapping, and so does Canada. Well, many creatures were trapped in addition to beaver. This is from a recreation of a trading post. We see a lot of different furs. There were marten, lynx, bear, fox, otter, wolf, deer, and moose that were all killed for their hides, and of course buffalo or bison as well. But beaver were far and away the number one animal trapped for their pelts. And it wasn't just the European Americans, as I mentioned. There were natives who were critical to the fur trade. They probably trapped more animals than anyone else. And they traded the furs they trapped for European goods like guns and cloth, tobacco, pots and pans. They often partnered with traders like the Cadottes or worked independently to sell to traders and various companies. Okay, we're going to go back to hats a little bit now. Specifically what we know as cowboy hats that became popular in the West because they were also made of beaver pelts, beaver felt. And they're durable, they protect in rain, snow, desert sun. We can see there's different styles of cowboy hats here. They kind of evolved from Spanish sombreros, and then this gentleman got really wealthy. His name is John Stetson. He moved from Missouri to Texas and began making hats. And Stetsons are still popular today. Hats like this one were popular in the West because the beaver felt made them nearly waterproof and extremely durable. I wouldn't say controversy, but there's some dispute about what kind of hats people wore in the Old West. And there was a historian named Lucian Beebe in the mid-1900s who looked at hundreds of early photos of outlaws, lawmen, and cowboys. And he found that the majority of them were wearing those kind of hats, bowlers or derbies. They were also made of beaver felt. They're also very, very durable, protective against the rain. Obviously, they don't give you the sun protection that a big Stetson would. But this one, a friend of mine loaned me, and it's like a helmet you can pound on it. It was tough. The most lasting style in beaver felt hats, the most popular over the world, was the top hat, which began to replace other styles late in the 18th century. And this is a drawing of a couple of French standing. You can see this one has an older style hat, but this guy is really up to date because he's got a new top hat there. They just kind of took over, and somebody asked me, why? What was it? I don't understand. I'm not sure I do either. I mean, why did they decide women should wear bustles under their dresses, and lots of fashion things that are not easily explained. Well, many companies made hats in the early years, and this is a drawing of one part of the process of making beaver felt hats. There were hat companies in England and France and Spain that shipped hats all over the world, to Asia, to South America, back to North America. Later on, there were companies in North America that made hats as well. One company in England, Christie's & Company, has been making hats for more than 250 years. They made hats for King George III of England, who was the king when the United States won its independence from Great Britain. More recently, they made hats for movies like The Godfather, and they still make top hats, and bowlers, derbies, and fedoras, and you can go online and buy one if you have enough money. But early hat making was dangerous. People like this guy, who's Carol's Mad Hatter, came about because of the expression "mad as a hatter," because hat makers often drooled, trembled, talked to themselves, and had bouts of paranoia. That's because mercury was used in one part of the hat making process to help get some of the longer furs that weren't used for the hat to separate out from the other shorter interlocking furs. But mercury poisoning causes many problems, including brain damage, nerve damage, and injuries to the lungs and kidneys. So the United States banned the use of mercury in hat making in 1941. I don't know, it's probably still used in other parts of the world. Well, I'm going back to Voyageurs, and this picture, I just really liked it because it shows these two gentlemen who clearly aren't doing any paddling or work. They're the important traders. But this guy wears a top hat in the canoe. This Voyager has some sort of hat that could be a top hat, as does this one, and this guy who looks like a Native American over here. So top hats, the really good ones, were for the traders, but others wore them as well. Well, I don't know what kind of headwear the Cadottes wore. I like to think that they may have been like this guy here, as later on in their career when they became, I wouldn't say wealthy, but became reasonably well-to-do and had their own employees, voyageurs, who would paddle them around. We do know they traveled by canoe extensively on Lake Superior, going to Montreal, to Mackinac Island, to Grand Portage, and other places. We know Michel and Equasayway both spent a lot of time in canoes on Lake Superior and rivers of northern Wisconsin. And we know they made one very important trip to Mackinac Island in 1830 to get married. They had already been married in a traditional Ojibwe manner sometime in the late 1780s. But they got married at this church on Mackinac Island, which is St. Anne's Catholic Church. I don't know if the building looked the same in 1830, but it was on the same site. So why did they decide 40 years after they were first married that they ought to go to a church and get a marriage license, which they did with the Americans? I'm going to read another short piece from my book here. Nothing in the record of Michel Cadotte's life suggests that he was impetuous or that he and his partner Equasayway were prone to making spur-of-the-moment decisions. So when they decided to get married in a Catholic church in 1830, more than 40 years after they first became husband and wife under Ojibwe custom, they must have had a good reason. In fact, they had multiple reasons to have their marriage recognized under European American rules. Notably, there were important court cases that were changing how marriages between European men and Native women were viewed by authorities. Treaties had been forged that made marriage issues more significant for mixed ancestry couples like the Cadottes. And substantial cultural changes were on the horizon as the first of the Protestant missionaries began to arrive at Lake Superior. It became apparent that Michel and Equasayway were responding to the changing circumstances of their world. They were demonstrating the same adaptability and resiliency they had shown at different periods in their lives when situations demanded change. I told them when I first got involved in doing the research for this book, I was really intrigued by Michel and Equasayway and the Cadotte family because they were involved. Their names appeared so often in important events related to Lake Superior and the fur trade. That was just curiosity, but later on I really came to respect them and what they did because Michel and Equasayway and also his father, Jean-Baptiste Cadotte Sr., and his brother, Jean-Baptiste Cadotte Jr., worked hard to prevent violence between Native Americans and European American traders, between different Native American tribes. They were constantly stepping between the white world and the Native world and French Canadian world, and somehow they managed it for many decades and became successful despite setbacks. So I really grew to respect them, as did others. This is a quote from former U.S. Senator William Pilas. The Cadottes were trusted by Indians and the white man alike, and I think that's true. Well, that's my presentation. I'll try and answer any questions you have. So the question is, were the Cadottes involved with the British from the American Revolution during the War of 1812 and beyond? And the answer is definitely yes, they were. Jean-Baptiste Cadotte Sr. helped recruit Native Americans for one important, the most western battle of the Revolutionary War. A number of the Cadottes, actually Michel's sons and some cousins and others, joined the British in the War of 1812. And then after that war was over, until then, even though there had been a treaty that theoretically placed the southern shore of Lake Superior in American hands, it wasn't until after the War of 1812 that theoretical boundary became real. So after that, Michel had to basically purchase American citizenship for, I believe, $5, and then he worked with the Americans.
Curious, where you said you hiked a trail somewhere? That was a fur trade trail?
Yeah.
Was that on Madeline Island? Or?
No, that is stretching from Ashland, and it goes all the way down to the Chippewa River. Okay. I didn't do all of that. I did, with my son, a small part of it. I'm going to ask my sister quickly, Janet, what's the name of that trail?
North Country Trail.
The North Country Trail.
You mentioned that it was 400 miles from Mackinac Island to Madeline Island when they were traveling back and forth. How many days did it take them to do that in canoes?
It would usually take them almost a week. You know, if the weather wasn't bad, they weren't fighting waves, they could make a good 50 or 60 miles in a day. But the weather could force them to pull ashore and camp for a while, too. The question was, how long did it take them to go from Mackinac Island to Madison? Roughly 400 miles.
Thanks, Bob, for that talk. I know it was speculation, the numbers of beaver that were taken out, but still it had to be an enormous number. I'm curious, did they have a system where they were able to trace it back to the rightful trapper, to the company, was there fraud involved? Did you run across any of that?
You know, in looking at the ledgers of the Cadotte family in the Hudson Bay Company, I didn't see any kind of tracking like that. They could tell from the color and quality of the beaver that the best ones came from furthest north in Canada, but I didn't see anything like the ledgers would say, today we ship 10 packs of beaver, and it might say from Chippewa River or something like that, but not a specific trapper or nothing more.
How did in the mid last century, what kind of trading was going on then, or marketing?
It was pretty small scale, and like you said, they had to take them to Milwaukee or other places. By then, it wasn't so much beaver, it was mostly mink, and then they were also in the middle of the last century, they were getting mink farms and fox farms where the animals were raised just for their fur. But nothing, I mean, individuals, my cousins, trapped for a long time. Just small scale, make a few extra dollars, it wasn't large scale stuff. And then there were for places you could take your furs to sell them, and I think there are more in Canada. There were still places that had a big sale, like once a month or once every couple months, to acquire furs for different companies. The post on Madeline Island, by 1840, which is last year the Rocky Mountain Rendezvous, in 1840, the American Fur Company on Madeline Island stopped using it as a fur post and switched it over to becoming primarily fishing. They were fishing for sturgeon and other fish on Lake Superior. And then later still, it was a place for shipping logs.
In terms of being a Métis family, how did the Indian Removal Act and all affect them with all the treaties that were being signed in every 2 areas? Did they lose their land?
Some of it, yes. They were given is not the right word. There were designated lands for members of the Cadotte family, and
So they were affected.
oh,
I was just going to also say with the Rocky Mountain rendezvous, James Minster's book Centennial talks about it.
oh yeah. Everybody in Colorado knows that.
Grand Portage was a large fort and receiving area for furs and so forth. Which was bigger, Grand Portage or Madeline Island?
I would say Grand Portage. It was the place where the Northwest Company, which was the premier company in this particular region for about 40 years, from the late 1700s into the mid 1800s. That was where they took their fur, they took their trade goods and brought their furs out. But they did it in kind of almost like the Rocky Mountain Rendezvous once a year, a big gathering where the people from Montreal showed up in the canoes with the trade goods, and the people from back out west in the wilderness showed up with the furs. They had company meetings there. There are documents that show them talking about this trader needs to be fired, this guy's doing good. But I think there were probably far more furs that went through there and more trade goods that went through there than Madeline Island. But Madeline Island was important, as I said, on the southern coast, east from your southwest coast. Yes, sir.
Before I ask my question, I just wanted to say the Cadottes are my first cousins, and I really enjoyed the read. It's a great book.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to ask, when you interviewed the living family members, how useful was that? What sort of percentage of information is in their living history versus what you got through other means?
So how useful was the information I received from Cadottes living today or in the 21st century? There was definitely some really good stuff. One family provided me with their own family tree, which showed they're descending from Michel Cadotte. Others talked about their oral history and of the family and the family on Madeline Island, because until the 1950s, the Cadottes still owned property where the Cadotte compound was on Madeline Island. So it was very useful in that respect. I probably got more stuff from written documents than I did from the oral histories, but I would not discount the oral histories at all.
So we didn't have any questions virtually. We just had 2 comments. One saying, greetings from Bavaria. I used to work with a Cadotte while working in Michigan. His family originally came from the UP. And then our second commenter says, thank you for your presentation. I'm a Mackinac Island Cadotte, and I've been interested in our family history since I was a child. Really happy smiley face. So.
All right.
Any personal opinions expressed today during the presentation are those of the speaker and are not necessarily those of the Wisconsin Historical Society or the Society's employees.